So here's a quick little video about Napoleon for us and talking about how Napoleon both reflects the ideas of the French Revolution and how he doesn't reflect the ideas of the French Revolution. So, one, you have to understand how Napoleon would reflect the ideas. Is Napoleon basically came from very low upbringing. He's Corsican. He was made fun of when he was a child working when he was in the or a young man when he was in the Royal Military Academy for not having a true French accent. But he was brilliant. His family had used basically all the money they had to get him in, and then they were basically betting on him pulling the family out of their debt. If it weren't for the French Revolution, Napoleon wouldn't have rose to his position. When he uses the ship's cannons, or when he uses his cannons to drive off French naval vessels by overshooting them, even though his commanders wouldn't support his idea, but Napoleon going to when the members of the National Assembly were there viewing the troops and then convincing them to allow him to do this sh- showed his mental and his political prowess. He later defends the National Assembly from approaching royalists by using a whiff of grape shot, as he called it, to drive off the attackers. Again, endearing himself to the National Assembly and showing his brilliance. He became a hero in the Italian campaign. He conquered most of northern Italy, which later he's going to actually unify many of these areas into the Kingdom of Italy. So his early victories, based on his abilities, not on his position in society, shows a clear concept of the French Revolution. Napoleon is, however, going to run into a few problems. He does try to take over the lucrative trading routes of North Africa in the Battle of the Nile, but Nelson, as you see here in the picture, stops him from doing this. And with his army in near defeat, Napoleon looks at his possibility of not being able to rise to power. However, again, this idea of promoting a secular, educated, almost enlightenment concept of science and mathematics and of education, Napoleon did promote this early fledgling concept of Egyptology. And one of these things that came out of this was the Rosetta Stone, which was saved because he brought these scientists with him, and which this will then allow us to translate hieroglyphics later. Oh, so this is what Europe was like 1800. So Napoleon then, with the help of his brother, is going to stage a coup d'etat. He's going to seize power. So I would say that's probably not a French Revolution idea. But yet, and he is then proclaimed first consul, much like Julius Caesar. Okay, so that probably would not be an example of a Renaissance or a French Revolution idea. And the fact that in 1802 he makes himself consul for life, and then 2 years after that he's proclaimed emperor. I'm pretty sure emperor is not a French revolutionary idea, and that it's inherently the idea. But then again, we call this the Voltaire age. The beginning of the French Revolution is Montesquieu because they're checking and balancing the political system, and then Rousseau because it's the will of the people that's manipulated and driven by Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. This is Voltaire because Voltaire sees this idea of an enlightened monarch. So the idea that this reflects the ideas of the French Revolution, the Enlightenment. This is where we're going with this. So, but he does create, as you can see, a council state, the tribunate, the legislature, the Senate, all that debate, pass laws, and define what those laws are. Very much a Montesquieuist idea of checks and balances. However, again, he is emperor, which is probably not what we're talking about in an idea of the French Revolution. He is going to establish the Bank of France, which then moves away from mercantilism and moves more towards an economic system. Again, solving some of these problems of the French Revolution. So the fact that he's focused on trying to fix the economic system, that would be a French Revolution, an Enlightenment idea. He's also going to, the core date of 1801, he's going to, however, this would be going the opposite direction of the French Revolution, and that he promotes the Catholic Church, resolving some of the disputes of the civil constitution of the clergy. and giving back property to the church's debt that was confiscated, and allowing the Catholic Church back into education and into the state. However, his Catholicism, this declared the major religion of France again. So it's moving away from the secularism of the French Revolution, which is not a concept of the French Revolution, but you could argue that it is a concept of the Enlightenment, and the idea of you're allowing Catholicism to be part of this again. But then again, how he's not part of this is that he himself crowns himself. He takes the crown from the emperor, and then on top of it, he declares himself emperor without the power of the Catholic Church, and he also will hold the Pope hostage for a period of time. So I'm sure that's not religious ideas of um, religious, religious um, freedom. So he's also created the Lycée, which allowed individuals to move up through education, and people could then find themselves in a position of power and intellect by their own skills, no matter what social class they're in. He's going to create the Legion of Honor in 1802, which awards individuals for courage on the battlefield, not because of their prowess. And he loved to give away medals. He is going to create this thing in 1804. Now, this is the one that you could say is kind of a little bit of this and a little bit of that. In 1804, he's going to establish the Napoleonic Code, which basically divides laws into personal status, property, and acquisition of property. For the first time, all French are equal before the law, which is definitely a principle of the French Revolution. And in fact, it's a codified concept of law. A lot of it deals with the ideas of property and the idea that no matter what social class you were, you had a right to it. And no matter what your birthright is, you had a right to it. However, women are going to be, even though and this can be spread all throughout Europe, this Napoleonic Code is. And this is one of probably the longest reaching concepts of it. But equality before the law doesn't apply to Napoleon, and it sure as heck doesn't apply to women, which you could kind of argue is a French revolutionary idea. But again, it's not an Enlightenment idea for the simple fact that women are allowed to own property, their belongings, or even their children are property of their husbands. And on top of it, that they're not even citizens unless they're married. You're also going to see the Haitian Revolution is going to take place during this time period. We'll spend more time talking about this later. We're also going to see the Louisiana Purchase takes place in 1803. So I guess maybe the relationship between France and America that you saw during the Revolutionary War is a concept of the French Revolution. But you're also seeing that this is an idea of Enlightenment, is the idea that you're negotiating treaties, not just taking land or issues like that. When we get to the emperor, it gets a little bit more dicey. He is going to try to invade England by moving his navy out of the Mediterranean, and he's going to get in a whole lot of trouble with Nelson again. Nelson is going to head him off. This is going to have the same effect as what happens in the Battle of Britain, that with Hitler tries to invade England without his air power which is taken out by the RAF, he can't invade England. Well, same thing here. Nelson's defeating him at the Battle of Trafalgar makes it so he has no naval power to have an invasion of England, which then, of course, makes him turn towards Russia. We're going to see the major military campaigns take place. Austerlitz, which is one of his greatest victories. He defeats the British, Austrian, and French forces in these battles. And we're going to see the beginning of nationalism and the Confederation of the Rhine, and the fact that Germans now feel that they could create a unified state. So we're going to see Napoleon's going to spread the concepts with the Kingdom of Italy and the Kingdom of Naples and the Confederation of Rhine. This large amount of nationalism is going to start spreading, and it's going to inspire more and more growth towards unification. And this also begins the beginning of what we call the continental system. And again, you see this as maybe a challenge to mercantilism, but at the same time, the idea of limiting trade to only Europe to keep out England is very much an EU kind of concept we're going to see, because it does open borders for trade and without taxation on goods, and allows more free flow of trade. So that would be kind of an Enlightenment idea. but it is going to spark the War of 1812, and it's going to spark two of the major mistakes by Napoleon. That this campaign is going to spark the war with Russia, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, and it's going to create the Peninsular Campaign. The Peninsular Campaign is Portugal will not comply with the continental system. So to stop Portugal, to get to them, he goes through Spain. But the invasion of Spain turns into a fiasco, in that he's going to pour in hundreds of thousands of troops, putting his brother, the King of Spain, and this causes a major uprising. And that uprising leads to massacres in Madrid and other areas, which then compounds this one, the famous the 3rd of May, 1808 by Goya, which is a romantic piece that shows the sacrifice, the martyrdom of the people executed by the French troops. So definitely, again, probably not a French revolutionary idea. But then this Spanish ulcer flames. You have the guerrilla warfare that takes place in the country, the drawing in of 500,000 French troops. He basically, after 5 years of fighting here, he has to give it up. Then Napoleon he's also one thing would definitely not make him part of the French Revolution or the Enlightenment is the number of monarchs he makes. Basically, everyone in his family becomes a monarch during this time. He gives them land and titles. He also, at this point, even divorces his wife, Josephine, so he can marry a German princess so he can get himself royal blood. So that's probably not one of the ideas of the French Revolution or the Enlightenment. His biggest blunder, of course, is the invasion of Russia. And the problem and this is one of the longest concepts of, is that Napoleon was fighting what we call limited war. And his impact later in the world is that basically every commander in America, Europe, everywhere studied Napoleonic tactics and fought this limited idea that once you get the enemy in check, in other words, they can't maneuver without being wiped out by you, or that their capital is seized. Basically, the war is over. And they all fought with these Napoleonic tactics. And the efforts after this war to keep Napoleon from happening again somewhere else creates this balance of power. That balance of power makes it so that there's no major wars. So, coupled with the fact that there's no major wars, and then on top of it, you're going to see a large number of the studying of Napoleon sets Europe up for World War One. That they're not prepared for the amount of violence and that's going to take place in the next war because they haven't seen it, because they haven't had a war like this, unlike the United States with the war between the states. Well, he marches into Russia. Well, Russia's playing by the new rules that are coming from the United States and Russia. It was called scorched earth and total war. The Russians strip their land of basically anything that could be edible, and then on top of it, poison their wells and burn their crops. And then once he takes the city of Moscow, they don't surrender. They say niet. They stay outside. They leave his army to founder in the city, waiting for their surrender. Then on top of it, Napoleon sees his own capital, starting to fall, that there's questions about him not being there. So he's 500,000-man army is setting in Moscow, no surrender. And on top of it, he has no prize, so to speak. And that questions the political power. He goes back to save his power and take back Paris before it falls, leaving his army. At that point, the city has fires start breaking out, both from the actions of the French troops and the possible release of criminals that were burning the city in Russia. And so his army retreats. But then at that point, Kutuzov, the general of the Russians, decides this is the time to attack. So as they retreat, they're basically cat and mouse as Russians then start attacking their flanks, and eventually his army of hundreds of thousands French troops, many of the Allied troops have deserted and left, and then his 100,000 French troops are down to 40,000 as survivors because of this. Then everybody dogpiles on him. The Sixth Coalition, we're going to see everybody goes after him. The Battle of Dresden, he is then massive. The French do win this one, but the casualties are mounting. But then at Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, he is defeated. He is forced to abdicate and then forced to Alba, where he is left. Louis XVIII, who is a Bourbon, comes to the throne, but the state is quickly falling apart. And Napoleon escapes because France again is coming apart. He gets there, and then thinking basically the English let him escape. But then the problem is because they're afraid of another French Revolution. The problem then is that once he gets there, he goes right back to his old ways, and that led to another set of wars. And we get Napoleon is defeated at the Battle of Waterloo by Wellington, and ending his era. Out of that, he's then exiled to St. Helena, where he dies and sets up the next age as we try to put Europe back together again after Napoleon.